Hey, this is Mr. Dykegraph talking to you a little bit. For those of you who have not met me, I teach history here at Cavallaro, and we're going to talk a little bit about the 5 types of conflict that Native Americans and white settlers had as white settlers moved to Washington State. So we're going to talk about kind of the issues that led to Indian wars and other things like that in our state. But I think before we talk about the idea of conflict in Washington State, it's really important to talk about conflict in general. Sometimes we have this idea that fighting just happens, that we go from we're really safe and we're all happy, and then one thing happens and we blow up and we're fighting. And I don't know about you, but when I look at instances in my life where fighting happened, it was very rarely one thing. It kind of builds up, right? So maybe when you're at home, you fight with your brother and sister all the time. I know I fought with my sister literally all the time. And when I look back at my fights, very few of them were about one event. They kind of built on each other and got layers and layers and layers and built up until eventually there's this big explosion of anger. So maybe I woke up in the morning and went downstairs and my sister had used almost all of the milk, but left just enough in the bottom to get my cereal wet without actually having a bowl of cereal. So I had a cereal with no milk. Of course, she put the milk right back in the fridge. I pour it out, a little splash of milk happens, and I have dry cereal. Then I go back up to take my shower, and she's used all the hot water. So I have a cold, lukewarm shower. Then I go to brush my teeth, and I don't know about you, but we shared a bathroom when I was growing up, and I try and squeeze the toothpaste, and there's no toothpaste left. So I go to school all day, kind of having a crummy day. Then I come home that night and eat dinner. And she's taken the best piece of lasagna from the middle of the pan, and I get the crusty edge. And then the top of it all is that night I go to get a bowl of ice cream after swim practice, and I find out my sister has carved out all of the chocolate and caramel sauce from the ice cream. So I'm left with plain vanilla ice cream, and she had chocolate Wonderland. And I look at that ice cream and I just start yelling. This actually happened, right? I'm screaming at my sister, "How dare you? I can't believe this happens." And when you look at that, it looks ridiculous in the moment, because why on earth am I screaming about ice cream? Why is this fight happening? But it's not about the ice cream. It's all of these individual conflicts that just kind of build and build and build. And I'll bet you if you think about some fights you've had with family members or friends or those kinds of people, most of them are that way. They're about these kinds of building up of events. And so when we look at fights with between Native Americans and settlers, or we look at wars like World War II or all of those, if you look at just one event, it looks silly. But if you look at the timeline and all of these things happening, we can understand where the conflict comes from. And that's what we're going to talk about this week, is where these conflicts came from. And it wasn't just an event. It was this building where it turns out into this thing at the end where we end up having to wear our get along t-shirt or whatever it is. So as we look at this, it's really important to empathize with that building. And it's also important to empathize that with the fight with my sister, none of those individual things are necessarily her being evil either, right? She took a shower and used the hot water. That's not her attempting to get me. Her using ice cream and scooping all the chocolate out isn't her trying to hurt me. I would have done the same thing. We all do that. We all mine for cookie dough or whatever it is in the ice cream. So it's also important to recognize that just because one side sees this huge thing happening doesn't mean the other side is even aware of it, right? And so it's also important to look at perspectives. What does one side see and what does the other see? And that's what we're going to dig into in these next couple weeks. So let's talk a little bit about leadership. So as we go into leadership, it's really important to look at the idea of leadership as a kind of a big deal, right? And the thing about leaders is we can all recognize what a leader is, but we all look at leadership as different, right? So if the classic example is a group project. We've all had that group project in middle school that we all freak out over, right? We all have to work together. And some of you hate it because you're just going to run the whole show and do all the work for everyone, and they're just going to get a grade. Someone else knows that they're just going to feel steamrolled and no one's going to listen to them and they're just going to have no say in it. And we can all look at this project and we all are worried about who's going to run this group project. And we're all worried about different things. It's really important to understand leadership is different for every single person. So if you're in that group project, You could be really anxious because no one listens to you. You want to work together on it, and you want to listen to everyone's input, and you want to be heard yourself. And once everyone's talked and had the ability to share with each other, then we can start working on a group project. Some of you are 100% that way. Others of you look at leadership a whole different way. Some of you, when you're in a group project, just want to get started. So you just want someone to get it going, and let's just get the work done, and let's get finished as fast as we can. And so you just start right away, right? And any conversation is a waste of time. And that's a huge problem in a group environment, because how do you make both groups happy? How do you spend your time and listen to each other and collaborate and get the work done without wasting too much time? That's a clash. No group is wrong. Both are different ways to lead. But how do you work together? How do you cooperate when you have different ideas on what best leadership is? And that's a big deal that we're going to look at here. So when we look at Native American leaders versus white settler and American leaders, they have very different views on what leadership looks like. And again, it's really a fine line. If you look at classic examples right now, a lot of people would say Tom Brady is a great leader in football. He's demanding, and he requires all of these things from all of the people that play with him. And it gets them to Super Bowls. They've won a lot of Super Bowls. Other people wouldn't call what he does leadership. They would call it bullying. That he demands things, and he yells at people, and he belittles them and demeans them. And so how do you reconcile this idea that to some people that's leadership and it gets the job done, and to other people that's the opposite of leadership? It causes people not to want to work and leave and quit. And so as we look at Native American culture and white settler culture, we're going to look at leadership styles. And we've looked a little bit with this before with our stories. We already kind of know that in Native American culture, leadership was given to age and experience, right? Native Americans didn't, they had an abundance of resources in Washington, so wars were fairly rare for the most part. They were very seldom to starve to death, right? There were not a lot of those life and death decisions. And what they did was they really worked together. They had these things called tribal councils, where essentially the elders of the tribe, the older experienced members, would come together, right? They would talk to each other and they would work things out. And the benefit of that is each person has their own experience, right? Each person has the things that they're good at and that they understand, and they can talk about it. They've each come from different families, so they understand different perspectives in the town, in the society. And that work together really made a cohesive group. It was a family, right? These small tribes, these small communities would make these decisions together. And so everything was slow, everything was methodical, and everything was discussed, right? And that was their idea of leadership. So if they were making a group project, they would sit down together and decide who was doing each piece. And you would volunteer to do this, and I would volunteer to do that. And we would work together. It would take longer, but we would do it as a group. And if we all live in America, and you can understand American ideas of leadership were very, very different. I mean, if you look at the classic leaders in America and Native American culture, you would look at elders, right? Those wise, smart, older people who have listened to everyone else. In America, our leaders are not that at all. I mean, if you think of the greatest leaders in America, George Washington, a general, told other people what to do. He killed people who disagreed with him in the military during the Revolution, right? He was brash, he was loud, and he was elected. You're my leader, and you're going to tell us what to do. You're going to guide us. If you look at, again, in sports with Tom Brady, that's the same way. Russell Wilson and other quarterbacks. In the huddle, there isn't 7 people all deciding what play happens. The quarterback tells us what play is going to be run, and we all follow it, right? Same with the president. We have or generals. George Washington doesn't ask his soldiers what the plan should be. He's the leader. He tells them what to do. A president doesn't ask everyone, what do you think? He tells us this is the way America should go. And so America has these elected leaders who are supposed to represent everybody, and having that one decisive voice is a really big deal. And so as you look down here, you can see this is a big problem. So when we go to signing treaties, one group of people wants to talk about it for a long time and discuss and negotiate and think about it and chew on it, and then go back and sleep on it and wake up the next day and talk about it. They want to have that conversation. America didn't. Isaac Stevens wanted people to move here. He wanted that decision now. And in American ideals, the president would make that decision, or the governor would make that decision, or a person would make that decision for everyone. And so when he wanted this signed, he went to a Native American and said, "You're the representative," which just was not true in Native culture. And this is where we talk about perspectives. When Isaac Stevens picks a person to sign that treaty, he doesn't know he's ruining Native culture and that he's essentially destroying their ability to talk. He has his perspective from America. He doesn't have the Native perspective, just like my sister doesn't have the perspective of reaching into the ice cream and seeing no chocolate. She doesn't have that. All she saw was the chocolate, right? Native Americans don't know white culture is demanding that we have one leader. So both of them look at each other and they just don't understand. And that lack of understanding leads to huge conflict. I don't get why you're angry. You don't understand why I'm angry. What I'm asking is perfectly reasonable to you, and what you're asking is perfectly reasonable to me. But because we have different styles, those bubbles build, that fight builds. And again, as we look at this specifically, the one we really want to think about is those treaties. You read that treaty last week, the Medicine Creek Treaty, and we looked through it with Chinook jargon. And again, from Isaac Stevens' perspective, you signed it. The tribe signed it, and it was you had the opportunity not to sign it. If your leader didn't want to sign it, they didn't have to. From a Native perspective, they would take that treaty back and discuss it with their elders and think about it and chew about it and have those conversations and then make their decision. The problem was they had already signed the treaty. And so both perspectives. So when Native Americans are angry at the treaty and the language that takes them off their lands, Isaac Stevens would say, "Well, why did you sign it then? I don't understand." And the Native Americans would look at him and go, "Why did you make us sign this thing when we didn't get to even a chance to talk about it?" A lack of understanding between those two groups. And so as we look at these different versions of conflict, right, we have language that these treaties were impossible to read to Native Americans. They didn't match. There aren't words in Native American languages for things that white settlers are trying to grab, and there aren't words in white settler language in English for ideas of spirit and animism and all of those things for Native Americans. So this is the big first conflict, is this idea that we just do not agree on what a leader is and what leadership looks like.